New York Harbor, the summer of 1783. The war is over, the Americans have won, and a British general is doing something that enrages George Washington personally. On the docks, a clerk sits with a ledger and writes down the name of every black person boarding a British ship to sail out of the country free. Name, age, who used to own you. 3,000 people passed that table. The book they were written into still exists in 2 copies on 2 continents, and one of the men in it had escaped from Washington's own plantation. This is a countdown of black surnames recorded in the Book of Negroes, the British ledger of 18 black loyalists who sailed out of New York in 1783. And I have to tell you up front that this list works differently from the others, because this record works differently from anything else in black American history. Almost every document these countdowns have covered records black people as property or after slavery inside the United States. This one records them leaving it as free people with certificates of freedom in their hands, decades before the Civil War, before emancipation, before the country even had a constitution. And I chose these names for a reason I will be honest about at the end, because it changes who this video is actually for. But first, what is this book? When the British lost the Revolution, they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And the Americans put a clause in it demanding the return of all American property, which, in the language of the time, included enslaved people who had run to the British during the war. Tens of thousands had done exactly that, because the British had promised freedom to any enslaved person who left a rebel master and came to their lines. Now the war is over and the British are evacuating New York, their last stronghold, and the commander, Sir Guy Carleton, faces a decision. The treaty says, give the people back. British honor says, we promised these people freedom. Carleton chose freedom. He told George Washington to his face that he would not break the king's word to people who had trusted it. But he was a soldier, so he did it like a soldier. He ordered that every black person leaving on a British ship be inspected and recorded. Name, age, description, former owner, so that if the Americans later demanded compensation for lost property, there would be an exact accounting. The ledger was built to protect slaveholders' future claims. Instead, it became the largest single register of free black people in the 18th century Atlantic world. Picture a ship's manifest crossed with a freedom paper. Each line frees a person and documents them in the same stroke. Roughly 3,000 names written between April and November of 1783 by a committee of British and American officials that met every single Wednesday in a Lower Manhattan tavern. And the man who owned that tavern is himself the 9th name on this list. Here are the surnames. We start with the ordinary and we climb toward the ones you know. Number 18, Black, the first name in the American copy of the ledger, and you cannot invent better symbolism than the historical record just handed us. The very first person recorded on April 23, 1783, is a 35-year-old man listed as George Black, freed by a man named Lawrence Hartshorn. First line, first page of the largest register of free black people in the 18th century Atlantic, and the man's recorded surname is simply Black. Whether he chose it or a clerk assigned it, nobody can say. But the book of black freedom in America opens literally on the word. Number 17, man, and this is the last line. The final person recorded in the ledger on November 30th, 1783 is a 5-year-old girl named Betsy Mann, and next to her name is a phrase worth stopping on, born free within the British lines. Sit with that child for a second. She was born during the war, behind British lines to parents who had freed themselves, which means she never spent one day of her life as property. The ledger that opens on a freed man named Black closes on a freeborn child named Man. 3,000 people between them, and the bookends alone tell the whole story. Number 16, Jackson. Thomas Jackson's entry shows you the second kind of person in this book. He is listed as 40 years old, described bluntly by the clerk as a feeble old fellow, formerly connected to a man named Alexander McDonald. But here's the key detail. The entry says Jackson was born free and that he produced General Birch's certificate proving it. There were free black people in colonial America, not many but real, And when they left with the British, they had to prove their freedom on paper to get into the book. That certificate, signed by the British Commandant of New York, was the most valuable object a black person could carry out of that harbor. Number 15, Williams. Right beside that pattern is Caesar Williams, recorded at 41, called a stout fellow, connected to a man named Alexander Grant. And again, the entry notes, he says he was born free and produced Birch's certificate of freedom. I put Williams here on purpose because Williams is one of the most common surnames in Black America today, and here it is in 1783, attached to a free man boarding a ship out of New York. That is the thing this record does to your assumptions. A name you think of as coming out of slavery in the 1860s turns up here 80 years earlier on a free man leaving the country entirely. Number 14, Payne. Now we reach the Washington plantation, and the video's cold open pays off. Daniel Payne is listed at 22 years old. His former owner, recorded in the ledger, is General George Washington. Payne had freed himself from Mount Vernon about 4 years earlier, walked off the estate of the most powerful man in the new nation, and made it to the British in New York. And now here he is in the book, sailing out while Washington is actively demanding the return of his property. One line in a ledger, and it is a 22-year-old winning a direct contest against the future first president of the United States. Number 13, Squash. Deborah Squash was 20 years old, and she had escaped Mount Vernon in 1781. Also formerly owned, the ledger says, by General Washington. She is listed traveling with her husband, Harry Squash. Read what that means. A young enslaved woman fled the Washington plantation, reached New York, married a free man behind British lines, and boarded a ship to Nova Scotia as a free woman with her husband beside her. And every piece of that is documented by name in a British military ledger, while the man who claimed to own her was writing letters trying to get her back. George Washington was compensated for her. He never got her. Number 12, Perth. Mary Perth is one of the most remarkable people in the entire book. Once enslaved by John Willoughby of Norfolk, Virginia, she was separated from that family during the war and made her way to New York, where she met and married a man named Caesar Perth, who had also come out of Norfolk. They are listed on separate pages of the ledger, and they sailed together. And the Perths did not stop in Nova Scotia. Years later, they went further, across the Atlantic to Sierra Leone, to help found a free black colony on the West African coast. Mary Perth ran a shop and a mission school there. She was born enslaved in Virginia, and she died a free businesswoman in Freetown. Number 11, Wilkinson. Moses. Wilkinson, listed at 36, was blind and disabled, and he was one of the most powerful preachers of his generation. He had escaped slavery in Virginia, and he sailed on a ship called L'Abondance to Nova Scotia, where he built a Methodist congregation at Birchtown out of nothing. His preaching was so fierce that people said they feared for his health when he got going. His first convert was a woman named Violet, whose husband is coming up higher on this list. A blind man who had been property became the spiritual anchor of an entire free black settlement. The ledger recorded him as cargo to be accounted for. History recorded him as a founder. Number 10, Perkins. Cato Perkins was another of the black loyalist preachers who came out of the American South through the Book of Negroes into Nova Scotia and then onward to Sierra Leone. What makes Perkins matter is what he did when the promises broke. The land the British had guaranteed in Nova Scotia came late, poor, or not at all. So Perkins became one of the leaders who carried the settlers' grievances all the way to London to argue the case directly to the Sierra Leone Company. People enslaved 2 decades earlier, now standing in England, formally petitioning a British corporation for the rights they had been promised. The name in the ledger became a name on a petition. Quick thing, then straight back. If you have found your surname already, or you are 10 deep and still watching for it, subscribe now, because the top of this list is where the record turns into something almost nobody knows. And right after number 1, I'm going to tell you exactly where to search this ledger for free, and the one hard truth about it that decides whether your family is really in here. Number 9, Francis. Samuel Francis owned that tavern where the inspection committee met every Wednesday to decide who got into the book. He was a free black man, born in the West Indies, and his tavern was so central to the era that George Washington himself gave his farewell address to his officers there. The room where black freedom was documented and the room where the American command said its goodbyes were the same room, owned by the same black man. Francis Tavern still stands in Lower Manhattan today. The Surnames sits at the exact hinge of the whole story. Number 8, Kizell. John Kizell was born in West Africa, on Sherbro Island, kidnapped as a child and shipped to Charleston as a slave. He freed himself with the British during the war, was evacuated through this system to Nova Scotia, and then did the thing almost no one in the Atlantic slave trade ever got to do. He went home. In 1792, he sailed to Sierra Leone, back to the same coast he had been stolen from, and spent the rest of his life there. The arc that the ledger begins, Africa to slavery to freedom to Africa again, closes in a full circle around one name. Kizell was carried out of Africa as property and returned to it as a free man. Number 7, George. David George was born around 1742 in Essex County, Virginia, to enslaved African parents named John and Judith. Before the Revolution, at a place called Silver Bluff in South Carolina, he helped found what is widely considered the first black church in America, the Silver Bluff Baptist Church, around 1775. He came through the evacuation to Nova Scotia, planted Baptist churches across the province, was beaten and burned out of his home in a race riot at Shelburne, and then in 1792 led a portion of his congregation to Sierra Leone and founded the first Baptist church in West Africa. One man, 3 countries, and the founding of Black Baptist worship on 2 continents. It starts in the ledger. Number 6, King. Boston King was born enslaved around 1760 near Charleston, South Carolina, apprenticed to a carpenter and beaten savagely for tools other men lost. He escaped to the British in 1780, and his entry in the Book of Negroes lists him as a stout fellow, age 23, sailing on L'Abondance for Port Roseway with his wife Violet. He wrote down what that moment felt like. The terror that American slaveholders would seize them back before the ships left, a fear he said filled him with inexpressible anguish. He became a preacher, sailed to Sierra Leone, and left one of only 3 published memoirs by a black loyalist. Because Boston King could write, we can still read what it felt like to be a name in this book. Number 5, Bluck. Stephen Bluck was a free-born black man from Barbados who became the leading figure of Birchtown, the largest free black settlement in Nova Scotia and, at its founding, one of the largest free black communities in North America. He commanded a black militia, ran the settlement school, and corresponded with British officials as an equal. Birchtown was named for Samuel Birch, the general who signed the freedom certificates, and Bluck was the man who held it together in its hardest early years. When you read that thousands of people came through this ledger into a functioning free town with a school and a militia, Bluck is much of the reason that town functioned at all. Number 4, Peters. Thomas Peters had been enslaved in North Carolina. He escaped, fought for the British in a black unit during the war, came through the evacuation to Nova Scotia, and then became the single most important political organizer of the black loyalists. When the promised land and rights failed to materialize, Peters personally sailed to London to petition the British government on behalf of the whole community. That petition is what set the Sierra Leone resettlement in motion. He is sometimes called one of the first black political leaders of the modern age. He died in Freetown in 1792, months after finally reaching the free colony he had fought to create. The name in the ledger became the name that moved a government. Number 3, Snowball. Nathaniel Snowball appears in the Book of Negroes as a self-emancipated man, and his name stands for the ones who refuse to accept broken promises quietly. In Nova Scotia, when conditions collapsed, Snowball was among those who organized to leave for Sierra Leone in search of the freedom guaranteed on paper and denied in practice. His name is not famous, and that is exactly why it is here at number 3. Because for every David George and Boston King whose name survived, there were dozens like Snowball, ordinary heads of families whose single decision to move their households is the reason a free black colony existed at all. Number 2, Washington, not George, Harry. Harry Washington was, according to the ledger, about 43 years old, described as a fine fellow, and formerly the property of General George Washington himself, the future first president of the United States. He had escaped from Washington's world around 1776. He sailed out of New York on l'Abondance on the 31st of July, 1783, a free man, to Nova Scotia and later to Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone, decades later, Harry Washington did one more thing. He joined a rebellion of the settlers against the very company that governed them, still fighting for self-rule at the end of his life. A man who carried Washington's name to freedom spent his last years in armed revolt for the freedom he'd been promised. His entry is on page 90 of the British Ledger. Number 1, Birch, the name that made all of it possible, and the name almost nobody knows. Brigadier General Samuel Birch was the British Commandant of New York, and it was Birch who signed the certificates of freedom, the papers that turned an escaped enslaved person into a documented free one, the papers that got people into this ledger and onto those ships. His signature is on the pages. And when the largest free black settlement in Nova Scotia was founded, the black loyalists named it after him, Birchtown. So the number 1 surname connected to this record is not a depositor or a preacher. It is the name the free people themselves chose to put on their new town, in gratitude, because that signature was the difference between freedom and being sent back. Birchtown still exists in Nova Scotia today. It is named for the man who signed. Now the science, because people always ask what a DNA test can tell them here. It can tell you something real through a mechanism worth understanding. When 2 living people share long identical stretches of DNA, geneticists call it identity by descent. The segments match because they came from one shared ancestor. That is how autosomal cousin matching works, and it reaches back roughly the number of generations that separate us from 1783. 6, 7, 8 generations, right at the edge of what these shared segments can still reveal. Testing databases are now large enough that descendants of the black loyalists in Nova Scotia and Sierra Leone turn up as genetic matches to families still in the United States, the biological trace of relatives who chose different sides of one harbor in one summer. And now the honest word, because this channel does not deal in wishful thinking, and this record demands more honesty than any other on this channel. Most African Americans are not descended from the people in this book. That is the hard truth, and I am not going to soften it. The 3,000 people in the Book of Negroes left the United States. Their descendants are overwhelmingly Canadian and Sierra Leonean, not African American. Because the whole point of this ledger is that these people got out. If your family is black and American, your ancestors were almost certainly among the far larger number who did not escape to the British, who remained enslaved and whose paper trail runs through the census, the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bank instead. So why show you this book at all? 2 reasons. First, because a shared surname here is a genuine lead for a specific set of families. Anyone with black Nova Scotian or black Sierra Leonean ancestry, and there are Americans who do have exactly that through later migration back and forth. If that is your family, this ledger is one of the richest records you will ever find. And second, because the surname is never the proof, and this record proves why better than any other. Look at what is in these entries. Not just a name, but an age, a former owner, a birthplace, a ship, a date. Harry Washington is not findable because his surname was Washington. There are thousands of Washingtons. He is findable because the ledger says 43, formerly of General Washington, escaped around 1776, sailed on l'Abondance, July 31st. That is what identifies a human being. The surname only tells you which page to turn to. Everything that proves it is in the other columns. So here is how to search it, and it is free. Library and archives. Canada, has a fully searchable database of the Book of Negroes online. It holds the names of 2,831 of the roughly 3,000 people, free, searchable by surname. The Black Loyalist directory at blackloyalist.com gives you the abstracted entries in order. And the American copy, the Inspection Roll of Negroes, is at the U.S. National Archives. When you find a name, do exactly what I said. Do not stop at the surname. Read the age, the former owner, the birthplace, the ship, and the destination. Those columns are what let you follow the person forward into the Nova Scotia land grant records, the Sierra Leone Company registers, the muster rolls of Birchtown, or backward into the American plantation they escaped from, because the former owner column names the enslaver, and that name opens the colonial wills and estate papers on the American side. Tell me in the comments which surname and whether your family traces through Nova Scotia, Sierra Leone, or neither. Be honest about neither. It tells you which record is actually yours. Next video, we follow one of these people the other direction. We take a single entry in the Book of Negroes, a name, an age, a former owner, and we walk it backward off the ship out of New York and all the way to the plantation they ran from, using the enslaver's own papers. One line in a British ledger, and we find the American family it came from. Wait until you see how far back a single freedom certificate can reach.